Did the current national debate around immigration and some of the rhetoric around immigration, did that have an effect on your decision to write a children's book?
What's happening in the world impacts who you are as an artist, but I write really, really slow. One of the things about Donald Trump and this whole kind of white supremacist, white nationalist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant racism that we see is that it has really old roots. Since I was a young person when I first immigrated to the United States, this is a country that makes it really clear that as an immigrant, especially a poor immigrant of color, a poor immigrant of African descent from a Latino community, you're almost always on probation. That's what they make you feel. And you're almost always represented in the larger culture as some abomination or some criminal or some trouble. The fact that Trump's discourse was so popular is because it's so deeply embedded in so many places and in so many communities. I grew up being told we were a problem and being told that we come to this country because we're criminals and being criminalized, when in fact, all the immigrants that I knew made these immense sacrifices, worked like animals, almost cut off half their souls to make it in this country, to provide for their families out of love.
What do you think about President Trump's plans to build a wall here?
The United States already has the most militarized, the most defended, the most just difficult border for anyone to traverse in the world. This is a border that begins on the other side of Mexico. I think that ultimately the border for me is far more symbolic of this just collapsing imaginary, this kind of just messed up cynicism and messed up xenophobic nativism of so many people who feel lost and who feel threatened. This is a world and a country that is being devoured by economic elites. But if the average folk is so distracted and so confused that they think that the real person who's invading, the real person who's causing damage, and the real reason that they feel sense of loss and feel a sense of threat is because of Latino immigrants in the South. They think that somehow this wall will repair everything. Well, that's not true. Unfortunately, you're just walling yourself in with your predators.
What do you mean by the collapsing imaginary?
We're seeing the outcomes of a poor educational system. Completely, the public education system has cratered because, of all of these kind of conservative acts to defund it. So critical thinking is a rarity. When there's not a public educational system, people have been taught to be afraid of everything: outsiders, folks who are queer, folks who are poor, folks who are different than them racially. Ultimately, all of these things tie into a collapsing imaginary. People can't imagine that, your neighbor could be of someone good. They can't imagine that the future, if we pull together, would be better.
You've talked about how the scarcity of minority voices in publishing makes people internalize racism and identify more with whiteness than with themselves. What do you mean when you talk about the dream of whiteness?
We all learn languages. So you learn, let's say you're speaking Dutch, you're speaking Spanish, you're speaking English, you learn the language, you learn its grammar. Well, dreams is a language too. If the horizon that you learn doesn't involve you, you're going to learn that. In other words, if you're a girl who never sees girls as doctors or girls as mechanics, you'll learn that that's the language of dreaming, that when you dream what your future is, you will leave that out. And so if people of color are not being represented, they don't see themselves anywhere in the culture, you can't dream a thing that you can't see. You find it difficult. Let's be a little bit clear. You can, and people do, but it's a lot more difficult.
How do you hope that your latest book addresses some of these, the need to bring about some of these truths to young people in the United States?
Childhood is an important time where people begin to learn, in some ways, the basic grammar of the world they live in. And if you're left out of that basic grammar, then you've got to spend the rest of your life making up that deficit. So I thought one of the good things for me as an artist and as a writer would be to turn and try to do a kid's book to try to redress and address some of that deficit where so many kids of color are reading books that have nothing to do with them, that don't represent them. They, in fact, are reading books where they have to think of themselves or think of the world as completely white because that's all they see. And therefore, even when they think of the world, they're leaving themselves out because that's what they've been taught.
In The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, you talk about a curse that plagues the main character's home country. Do you believe in curses?
You're asking me in the light of a studio, do I believe in curses? I'm like, sure, no. But let's go out in the middle of the night in the countryside of the Dominican Republic and I'd probably have a different reaction. I will tell you that the United States is obsessed with curses because the United States is obsessed with this concept of itself of being blessed. It believes that it is God's chosen country. I mean, that's an old American story. If you believe that you are God's chosen country, that very act of believing that opens the possibility, the fear, the nagging fear that you might in fact be the opposite, that you might be God's cursed country. And I believe less in curses and I believe more in history and the weight of history and how history will always sort of imprison us unless we face it.
So actually my next question was going to be what would be the safa, the solution or the cure for a curse if there were a curse? And I'm guessing that you're going to say that it has to do with facing the reality of what's happening and then telling true stories.
Every culture is trapped by that which it disavows. Every culture is collared by the truths that it can't face. And you can't, it's not just that me and you decide to face this stuff. There has to be collective reckoning. For the United States to really move on is going to require the whole collective to admit some very basic things. Yes, the Civil War was fought over slavery. Yes, white supremacy is a reality. Yes, there is an enormous amount of structural and institutional racism. Yes, there's been an enormous amount of crimes and outright thievery and genocide against indigenous folks. There's all this history we have to face. We have to face it together. And only by coming to sort of a consensual collective agreement of what happened and to actually allow ourselves to look at it, to hold it, to mourn it, can we begin to get the energy that we're going to need to deal with this really kind of, scary future that we've created.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.